This is the story of Christopher Nolan and his wife Vanessa Nolan. They had built something that looked from the outside like a good life. A house with original hardwood floors, 2 cars in the driveway, dinners that were warm enough but rarely lingered past the meal. Christopher had loved Vanessa with the steady, undemonstrative devotion of a man who confused reliability with intimacy, who believed that showing up, day after day, was its own kind of declaration. Vanessa, for her part, had married a man she admired, but had slowly stopped feeling seen by, not because he was cruel, but because he was constant in the way furniture is constant, present without being noticed. The tension between them was not loud. It had no sharp edges. It was the kind of tension that lives in the pauses between sentences, in the way 2 people can share a bed for 11 years and still manage, somehow, to sleep on opposite sides of their own private silences. What unravels in the months ahead is not, in the end, about Derek Foster or a company dinner or a promotion. It is about 2 people who forgot to keep choosing each other and the quiet, irreversible cost of that forgetting. The Tuesday before the dinner, Christopher stood at the kitchen counter slicing a red bell pepper with the focused patience he applied to most domestic tasks, and Vanessa sat at the island with her laptop open, reading something that occasionally made her exhale through her nose in a short, mirthless breath. The kitchen smelled of garlic and olive oil. Rain pressed softly against the window above the sink. It was, by any objective measure, a peaceful evening. Hendricks moved the dinner to Friday, Vanessa said, without looking up. Black tie, apparently. He wants to impress the Meridian people. Christopher scraped the pepper into the pan. I know. She looked up then, briefly. You know. Marcus mentioned it when we talked last week. Vanessa returned to her screen. You didn't tell me. I thought you knew. He paused. Or I forgot. One of those. It was a small exchange, the kind that wouldn't register in any meaningful accounting of a marriage's health. But there was something in it, a faint, almost imperceptible asymmetry, that Christopher noticed without naming. He had been noticing things like that for perhaps 2 years, maybe longer. The way she stopped reading passages aloud from books she liked. The way she answered his questions thoroughly but without elaboration, as if she were responding to a form rather than a person. He did not bring these things up. That was one of his flaws. A studied aversion to emotional confrontation that he had dressed up over the years as maturity. He told himself he was giving her space. He told himself he was patient. What he was, more honestly, was afraid. Afraid that if he said something is wrong between us, she would agree. And then they would both have to decide what to do about it. They ate dinner. They talked about her sister's upcoming move to Portland, about a documentary he'd seen recommended, about whether the gutters needed cleaning before the season turn. Vanessa laughed once, genuinely, not politely, at something he said about their neighbor's new dog, and Christopher felt the warmth of it settle briefly in his chest, like something he'd almost forgotten was possible. After dinner, she went upstairs to continue working, and he sat for a while with a glass of wine and the low hum of the house around him. Christopher Nolan was 44 years old. He had built 2 companies, sold one, and held a silent equity stake in Meridian Consulting, a fact that appeared on no business card, in no email signature, in none of the places where men typically displayed the architecture of their accomplishments. He had learned early in his career that the most durable kind of power was the kind that didn't announce itself. He was, by nature, a quiet man, not cold. People who knew him well found him warm, even funny, but quiet in the deep sense, the kind of quiet that could be mistaken, over time, for absence. That was, perhaps, what had happened with Vanessa. He finished his wine and rinsed the glass and stood at the window for a moment, watching the rain move through the light of the street lamp outside. He was thinking, without quite meaning to, about Derek Foster, about the way Vanessa's voice changed slightly when she mentioned him, a kind of careful neutrality that was itself a kind of signal. He had met Derek 3 times at company events, a senior executive, well-dressed in the deliberate way of someone for whom appearance was strategy, confident without being especially interesting. He wasn't suspicious, exactly. Or he was. but only in the vague, sourceless way that a man sometimes is, when something in his peripheral vision won't quite resolve into shape. He turned off the kitchen light and went upstairs. Vanessa was asleep with her laptop still open on the bed beside her. Its screen dimmed but not dark, casting a pale rectangle of light across the comforter. He closed it gently and set it on the nightstand. He stood there for a moment, looking at her, at the way her hair fell across her shoulder, at the small furrow that persisted between her brows even in sleep. He thought, "I love you." He did not say it. He turned off the lamp and lay down beside her in the dark, and the rain continued and the house was very still. The dinner was held at the Alderton, a hotel that had been renovated recently enough that everything in it still smelled faintly of new carpet and institutional ambition. The private dining room on the 4th floor had been arranged for 30 guests, Meridian's senior team, several external partners, a scattering of board members, candles and low glass vessels, a string quartet in the corner playing something that was meant to be ambient, but occasionally became insistent. Christopher arrived with Vanessa at 7:15. She was wearing a dark green dress he hadn't seen before, and she looked, he searched for the right word, standing beside her as the elevator opened onto the 4th floor. Deliberate, not dressed up for an evening, dressed for something specific. "You look beautiful," he said. "Thank you." She adjusted the small clasp on her bag. "You look nice, too." They were seated at table 3, near the window. Derek Foster was at table 2, close enough for easy conversation, with a clear sight line to Vanessa across the centerpiece. Christopher noted this without reading it as anything beyond coincidence. The room filled around them. Wine was poured. The Meridian CEO, a dry-humored man named Hendricks, made a short speech about growth and alignment that everyone listened to with the particular kind of attention reserved for speeches by people who control things. It began subtly. It always does. Derek leaned across during the appetizer course to say something to Vanessa, something low, not meant to carry. And she laughed in a way that was different from the laugh Christopher had heard in the kitchen 3 days ago. That laugh had been sudden and real and slightly surprised. This one was controlled. It was, he realized, her good laugh. The laugh she used when she wanted someone to feel clever. He looked at her profile. She was still smiling, answering something Derek had said, and there was a quality in her posture, a slight forward lean, the kind of aliveness in the shoulders, that he recognized from early in their relationship, from years ago. He picked up his wine glass and looked at the window where the city moved silently behind the glass. The evening continued. Dinner was served, conversations rearranged and reassembled across the tables. At some point, the main course, he thought. Vanessa got up to refill her wine from the bar cart along the wall, and Derek followed a few moments later, and they stood together for perhaps 6 minutes, not looking toward their respective seats, speaking with the focused ease of two people who have already established, somewhere prior to this evening, a frequency they share. Christopher watched this with a feeling he couldn't immediately identify. It wasn't anger, it wasn't even hurt. Not yet. It was more like the sensation of recognizing a word in a foreign language you thought you'd forgotten, a slow, uncomfortable "oh." He turned to the man on his left, a CFO from Manchester named Aldbourne, and asked him something about the Meridian integration timeline, and Aldbourne answered at length. And Christopher listened carefully, and none of this distracted him. Later, during dessert, Vanessa returned to her seat and touched his arm briefly, a reflex, or a performance he couldn't tell, and said, "Derek was asking about the Hartwell renovation. I told him he used Kemper and Associates." "That's fine," Christopher said. She looked at him for a moment. "You're quiet." "I'm listening to Aldbourne's digression on depreciation schedules. It requires concentration." She smiled, uncertain whether he was being dry or withdrawn. He had cultivated, over the years, an ambiguity about this that he'd always thought of as wit. Tonight it felt like armor. After the main guests began to filter out, Christopher excused himself to use the restroom. The corridor outside the dining room was cool and quiet, paneled in dark wood. As he rounded the corner toward the men's room, he heard voices from the alcove near the service entrance. Low, distinct, oddly careful. Vanessa's voice. He said the review's in March. Derek's voice. March is fine. The committee responds to demonstration Vanessa. You know that. The work you've been doing, the visibility, it matters. A brief silence. I just need it to be based on the right things, she said, and there was something in her voice that Christopher had not expected. Not brazenness, but uncertainty. A kind of plea almost. It is, Derek said, with the smooth confidence of a man who has said reassuring things so many times that he no longer checks whether they're true. Christopher stood very still in the corridor for a moment. Then he continued to the restroom, washed his hands, looked at himself in the mirror above the sink for a few seconds longer than necessary. He looked, he thought, with something almost like detachment, like a man assembling information. On his way back, he passed the alcove. It was empty. He returned to the table. Vanessa was in conversation with the woman to her right, animated and warm. Derek was on the other side of the room with Hendricks, laughing at something. Christopher sat down, picked up what remained of his wine. Outside the window, the city was indifferent and bright. He thought, I need to know what exactly is happening here. Not from jealousy. Jealousy requires a kind of urgency he no longer felt, but from something quieter and colder. From the instinct, refined over decades, of a man who understood that the truth of a situation was usually available to anyone patient enough to stop performing and simply observe. He glanced at Vanessa. She caught his eye and smiled. That controlled, social smile. He smiled back. Then he looked down at his plate and thought, carefully, about Meridian Consulting. About the 23% silent stake he'd held for 4 years through a holding company that appeared in no org chart Vanessa had ever seen. About what that stake entitled him to. About the board meeting scheduled for the following Thursday. He said nothing. The string quartet in the corner began something slow and classical, and the evening moved on around him, and Christopher Nolan sat very quietly inside the knowledge he had just acquired. The way a man sits quietly inside a room he already owns. I don't know, Vanessa said, and then stopped, mid-sentence, her eyes going slightly distant as if she'd heard something. She looked for just a moment, not at Derek, or at the room, or at her wine glass, but at some middle point in the air in front of her, the peculiar, dislocated look of someone suddenly uncertain of their own narrative. Maybe, I don't know, maybe someone's watching all this and... She stopped again. The pause went on one beat too long. Maybe like, tell this story to someone. Or, subscribe or something. Derek stared at her. Subscribe to what? She blinked. The moment passed like a cloud shadow. Nothing. Forget it. I don't know why I said that. Derek looked at her with the particular concern of a man whose conversational footing has been disturbed. Are you all right? I'm fine, she said. Where were we? They drove home mostly in silence. Not the hostile silence of an argument, but the particular silence of two people who have reached, separately and without coordinating, the same unspoken decision. Not yet. Vanessa looked out the passenger window at the passing streetlights. Christopher kept both hands on the wheel. The radio was off. The heater made a low sound. Good evening, she said eventually, offering it perhaps as a kind of test. Parts of it, he said. She turned to look at him. He didn't turn. Did something happen? Not particularly. A pause. You seemed engaged. It was a networking dinner, Christopher. That's what you do at networking dinners. I know what you do at networking dinners. Another silence. Outside, a traffic light turned green. What does that mean? She asked. It means I know what networking looks like. He turned onto their street. I also know what other things look like. She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted. Not defensive, not yet, but careful. Derek is a senior partner on the committee that reviews my team's performance in March. I have spent 8 months doing extraordinary work that nobody on that committee has had any reason to look at directly. He has. He's noticed. That is a professional relationship that I am managing because I need to manage it. I understand that, Christopher said. Do you? Yes. He pulled into the driveway. turned off the engine. I understand exactly what you're describing. They sat in the dark car for a moment. I heard you, he said, in the corridor outside the dining room. The two of you. She didn't deny it. That was the thing he noticed first. She didn't deny it, didn't recalibrate immediately toward outrage or injury. She sat with it, which meant she had known, somewhere, that the conversation could be overheard. Or that it wouldn't have mattered even if it were, because nothing explicit had been said. You make it sound like something it isn't, she said quietly. What is it then? She turned to look at him, and her face in the faint light from the street lamp was tired in a way he hadn't seen in a long time. Tired not from the evening, but from something further back. It's me trying, she said. It's me trying to be visible somewhere, since I'm clearly not visible everywhere. The sentence landed the way she probably intended it to. Precisely, without cruelty. Like a key turned in a lock that had always been there. Christopher was quiet for a long time. That's not a justification, he said finally. No, she agreed. It isn't. She opened the car door. I'm not asking you to forgive me for something I haven't done. I'm telling you why I've been where I've been. She went inside. He sat in the car for another few minutes, looking at the dashboard. Then he took out his phone and wrote a short message to Marcus Aldborn, the CFO for Manchester, who also served on Meridian's Ethics Oversight Board, asking whether he had time for a call in the morning. He wasn't acting out of revenge. He wanted to be honest with himself about that, and mostly he was. What he was doing was something colder and more administrative. He was performing due diligence on information he had. If a senior executive was leveraging his committee position to cultivate personal relationships with staff whose promotion reviews he controlled, that was a governance matter. It had nothing to do with Vanessa, or with their marriage, or with the quiet devastation he felt sitting in his own driveway. He told himself this. He believed most of it. Inside, the lights in the bedroom window came on. He could see Vanessa's shadow moving behind the curtain, changing, setting down her bag, moving through the ordinary gestures of the end of an evening. He thought about the 11 years, about the hardwood floors they'd refinished together the summer after they bought the house, about the way she used to reach for his hand in the cinema without thinking about it, about when that had stopped, and whether it had stopped all at once or in increments so small that neither of them had noticed until it was simply gone. He went inside. They did not argue. They moved around each other in the bedroom with a careful, practiced courtesy that was its own form of grief, and eventually they turned off the lights, and the house was quiet. In the morning, Christopher made the call to Marcus Aldborn. He was precise and unemotional. He cited the conversation he had overheard, the pattern of behavior he had observed, the structural conflict of interest inherent in a committee reviewer maintaining this kind of relationship with a direct report under review. He did not mention Vanessa by name as anything other than a staff member whose professional standing had been compromised. Aldborn listened carefully. At the end, he said, I'll need to bring this to the full oversight board. Given your stake in the company, Christopher, I'll need to be transparent about the source. That's appropriate, Christopher said. I'd expect nothing less. He hung up. He stood in the kitchen in the early morning quiet, looking at nothing in particular. He did not feel triumphant. He had expected, perhaps, some version of satisfaction, the clean click of consequences aligning with cause. What he felt instead was something more like sorrow, slow and diffuse, the way water finds the lowest available point. The board convened a formal review in the second week of November. Derek Foster was placed on administrative leave pending investigation, and by December, his contract was not renewed. Language that meant, in the corporate idiom, what it meant. The company circulated no announcement. There was no public event. People who knew, knew. People who didn't ask. Vanessa found out from a colleague on a Wednesday afternoon via a message she read while sitting in her car in a parking garage after a meeting that had run long. She sat with the phone in her lap for several minutes. She thought immediately of Christopher, of the way he had said, I understand exactly what you're describing in the driveway that night, with a quietness that she had read as resignation and now read as something else entirely. She did not confront him that evening. She made dinner. They talked about an article he'd been reading about urban planning. She watched him across the table and tried to work out how she felt, and found that her feelings resisted easy organization. She was not, she decided, a victim of his actions. That narrative was available to her. She had seen how other women in her position might have claimed it, might have constructed Derek's removal as a kind of unilateral punishment imposed by a controlling husband. But she couldn't fully inhabit it, because she had been in that corridor, and she had known what she was doing there. Not completely, not in the explicit way that would have required her to look directly at it, but enough. What she felt, more honestly, was embarrassed. Not the sharp embarrassment of exposure, but the duller embarrassment of having been legible to someone she had convinced herself wasn't paying attention. She had told herself over the past year, over the past several years, if she was being rigorous, that Christopher didn't see her, that he had reduced her in the ledger of his attention to a domestic fixture, functional, familiar, unremarkable. She had built a significant emotional architecture on this premise. It had justified certain distances she'd allowed to develop, certain conversations she'd stopped initiating, a kind of slow withdrawal from the shared interior of the marriage that she'd framed to herself as self-preservation. He had seen her the entire time. This realization came to her not with relief, but with something closer to vertigo. She began, in the weeks that followed, what she privately called the revision, a quiet, unannounced re-examination of the past few years from a different angle, not self-flagellation. She was not a woman inclined toward that, but a kind of patient reassessment. The way you look at a photograph a second time and see in it something you missed in the first viewing. She thought about his silences differently. She thought about the moments she'd read as indifference and wondered how many of them had been a man waiting, in his quiet, confounding way, to be approached. Christopher, for his part, said nothing about the Meridian matter. He did not raise it. He did not, as she had half expected, use it as leverage, as evidence, as an occasion for the long clarifying argument she had been bracing for. He was simply there, present in the way he had always been present, which she was now unable to decide was a virtue or a form of cruelty. One evening in early January, cold, a light snow earlier in the day, she came downstairs and found him reading in the chair by the window, the lamp on, a glass of whiskey on the side table. She stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him. He didn't look up immediately. When he did, there was nothing in his face that demanded anything from her. "I know it was you," she said. "The board." He looked at her steadily. "Yes." She waited. He said nothing more. She had expected an explanation, or an apology, or an accusation. None of these came. He simply acknowledged it. She went and sat on the sofa across from him. They stayed like that for a while, without speaking. The snow outside had stopped. The street was quiet. "I'm not angry," she said finally. "I know," he said. "I want you to know that She stopped. Started again. "I don't think I did what you thought I was doing." "I know what you did and what you didn't do," he said. "That wasn't why." She looked at him. Then why? He considered it. In the lamplight, he looked older than she usually thought of him. Not aged, exactly, but lived in, because the arrangement was wrong, because a man in that position shouldn't be making promises to people whose careers he controls. That's the only reason. He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said, "but it's the one I can stand behind." It was, she thought, the most honest thing he had said to her in months. Possibly longer. She nodded slowly. The lamp made a small, warm circle around his chair. She pulled her knees up to her chest on the sofa, something she hadn't done in years, and looked at the snow-quiet street outside. "We've become very careful with each other," she said. "Haven't we?" "Yes. I don't know when that started." "Neither do I." The clock on the mantel counted quietly through several seconds. "I don't think that's entirely your fault," she said. "I want to say that." He looked at her, and there was something in his expression she couldn't quite read. Not gratitude, not relief, not the absolution of a man who'd been waiting to be told he was innocent, something more complicated, as if her saying it had opened rather than closed a door. "I know," he said again. And she wished he would say something different, something that would give her a foothold. But that was who he was, and she had always known who he was. By March, they had reached an agreement, not through a single conversation but through a series of small, incremental negotiations, conducted mostly in the language of logistics. Christopher was moving into a flat in the city for a period that neither of them would call indefinite, but that both of them understood was. Vanessa would stay in the house. The word separation was used twice, both times by the solicitor, and both times they had nodded at it with the careful neutrality of people who have already absorbed the word privately. The morning he was to leave, a Saturday pale March light, the first hint of something that might become spring. They moved around the house with the compressed efficiency of people managing emotion through task. He had 2 bags and a box. She had made coffee. These were the things that were true. He came downstairs with the box and set it near the front door and went back to the kitchen for the coffee she'd poured. She was standing at the window above the sink, looking at the garden. The forsythia was beginning to show yellow at its tips, the first color of the season ahead of everything else. "The garden will need attention in April," she said. Not looking at him. "I'll come by if you want," he said. "For the gutters." She turned from the window, looked at him. He looked the way he had always looked, steady, present, a little difficult to read. She thought about the first time she'd seen him at a conference 11 years ago, and how she'd thought, "That's a man who doesn't need to fill the room." She had found that restful once. She had found it insufficient later. She wondered now whether her reading of it had been the problem all along, whether she had asked him to perform a kind of visibility that wasn't in his nature and called his failure to perform it neglect. She didn't know. She had stopped being sure she knew things. "I used to read you passages from books," she said. He looked up. "I remember. I don't know when I stopped." He held his coffee cup and said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. "I kept thinking," she said slowly, "that you didn't notice things. About me, about what I needed." She paused. "But you noticed everything." "Not everything," he said. "More than I knew." He looked at the window. Outside, a car passed. The forsythia moved slightly in whatever wind was moving through the garden. "I think I made it easy," she said, "for you to be invisible to me, because it was easier than asking whether I'd become invisible to you." He looked at her then, and she saw something move through his face, not pain, exactly, but the acknowledgement of pain, which in a man like Christopher Nolan was close to the same thing. "You weren't invisible," he said. "You were—" He stopped. Started again. "I watched you every day for 11 years. The problem wasn't that I didn't see you." He set down his coffee cup. "The problem was that I never told you what I saw." She stood very still. He picked up the box. "That's mine," he said. "That's my—" He paused, looking for the word. "That's my failure. I can name it," she wanted to say, "then name it now. Keep naming it. Stay here and name it until we're both tired of hearing it and start over." She did not say this, partly because she didn't know if it was what she actually wanted, and partly because she could see, in the way he was standing, that he had made a decision, not in anger, not in finality, but in the particular kind of grief that understands that sometimes distance is the only way to see a thing clearly. "The gutters," she said finally. "Yes, come by in April." "I will," he said. He looked at her once more, not long, not dramatically, just looked, the way a person looks at something they are trying to hold in memory. Then he picked up his bags and the box and went to the door. She turned back to the window. The forsythia was very yellow against the pale morning sky. She listened to the front door open and then close. Not hard, just closed. The sound of a door completing its function, and then the sound of his car in the driveway. And then the street, and then nothing. She stood at the window for a long time. She thought about the word invisible, about how each of them had used it to describe the same marriage, from opposite sides, about how two people could stand in the same house, in the same light, and each be unable to see that the other person was looking. She thought we were so careful not to make demands of each other that we forgot to make requests. The coffee on the counter had gone cold. The garden was still. The forsythia burned yellow at the edges of her vision, persistent, indifferent, alive. She did not cry. She thought she might later. She thought there was probably a great deal of feeling still queued up somewhere, waiting for her to be alone enough to access it. For now, she stood at the window and watched the first color of spring move gently in the wind, and felt the full, exact weight of what had been and what had not been, and what had been lost so slowly that neither of them had known to hold on. The house held its silence around her. Somewhere, Christopher was already on the motorway, both hands on the wheel, and the forsythia kept opening, because that is what forsythia does, keeps opening, even in the cold, even when no one is there to see it.